Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time it is for you. This is a chapter that's got a lot of information in it, and I'm going to touch on some key points and just make sure that you still read the chapter and look at the main point, the narrative in it as well. But I think there's a lot of good information in it that you will find helpful in your day-to-day life. Now, I'm not giving you quizzes, but by the time you're done, my hope is that you can understand some of the science of addiction and provide some examples of addictions, if an addiction, the process, and also be able to read more about the potential treatments associated with overcoming addictions. So addictions can often be thought of as being positive. And an example could be running, and that's what's given in your chapter. Running, I run and I'm addicted to running, and if I don't run, I just don't feel like my day is right. So people will think of that as a good addiction, but it still is something that you seek out, that you get that dopamine hit with. The main focus of the information in this chapter is when an addiction becomes problematic. And when it becomes problematic is when the need or the craving for that behavior or substance becomes counterproductive. You start to lose the benefit of that practice or substance, and you no longer get the original joy that you earned from doing it, and it becomes necessary, and it becomes a compulsion. As I mentioned a minute ago, addictions can be substances or they can be behaviors, and substances have been especially in the news in terms of drugs, oxycodone, for example, methamphetamine, heroin. So we're talking either illicit or prescription drugs. Alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine are three other examples. Now, there's a lot of behaviors that can be identified as having the potential to become addictive. And this list is certainly not all-inclusive, but I think it gives you a good start of what kind of way or what kind of things can become addictive. And I can put social, where it has using computers, social media is also could be listed on here as something specific using your computer, whether it be your cell phone or your laptop. You can become addicted to a relationship, a person that's not good for you. So there are a number of behavioral behaviors that would fit in here. And when we do have the thought of addiction, we need to look at how addiction influences or impacts our whole person, our whole self, and that there are physical, emotional, mental, psychological aspects that are involved. And when we try to cut out or cut away from that addiction, that it influences us in multiple ways. For the science of addiction, previously we still often have individuals that are focused primarily on the genetics and the chemistry. And they think that if you are predisposed, or understanding the predisposition and also how that physiologically how your body physiologically or biochemically responds, that is the understanding of addiction. But what has changed is that we can understand that it's not quite that simple. There is a biochemical component to it. As I mentioned, there's we'll mention it in a minute, the biochemistry or the metabolism or certain neurotransmitters that are involved. There's also a predisposition, but it's not a guarantee. So just because you have an immediate family member who who has an addiction to a substance, for example, doesn't mean that you are going to be, but there is a genetic component to it. The biopsychosocial is tying in much more than what's in the biomedical. We look at how our relationships, where we live, our social environment, our interactions with people, also what kind of personality that an individual has does play a role in addiction. And so individuals that have a lot of negative self-talk, for example, have a greater likelihood to have an addiction. The chemistry of addiction involves neurotransmitters, and one particular one is dopamine, and this pathway is involved in this whole chemical pathway is involved in the mesolimbic pathway, and it's also referred to as the reward pathway. When you have the substance or the behavior that you participate in, you get this flood of neurotransmitter that goes along that pathway reward system and gives a feeling of high, of pleasure, and we all can think of something that maybe you've eaten over the past, maybe over a holiday, and you think, oh, it just reminds me of my grandma, my mother, or I have, it's just the taste, the texture. There's a pleasure component in that. That's part of the dopamine system. As a person has more exposure to that substance or behavior, it takes more and more of the substance or behavior to give the same sense of pleasure. And this is called downregulation. So you need more or adaptation. It's also, you could think about it as being tolerance. It's needing more to get the same sense. So think about a person when they first start smoking, they don't go directly to 2 packs of cigarettes a day. They smoke a little bit and they get a sense of pleasure from it, and then over time you'll see people that have been smoking for a long period of time often will smoke multiple packs, or will need to have more cigarettes to kind of get that same sense of pleasure. And as somebody has that long-term involvement, you can start to have poor decision making, and a person will no longer have the same kind of pleasure. And this is when it becomes, especially with some illicit drugs, we'll go down that way, that you don't get the same kind of pleasure, but the craving is super strong, and even though you don't get that same sense of high, the craving is still there. And so that just becomes a very high level of focus on that drug, for example. Here is the quick picture of what's shown in your textbook figure 2. The reward pathway or the mesolimbic pathway involves either it involves dopamine, and it involves the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and some other circuits of the a couple circuits in your brain. The places of cognitive or reasoning occurs in the prefrontal cortex, and it doesn't really well develop until 2022, sometimes a little bit later. And so we run into difficulties with individuals that are exposed to some of these behaviors or substances when they're young, and their brain doesn't have that reasoning component, and they can become very, very strong. Those addictions can become really strong, and it makes it exceptionally more difficult to quit. And a person who starts early in their life with some kind of a substance is more more susceptible to relapse as well. So the concern that I always had, and I have a daughter who's 32 now, going to be 33. My ex-husband is an alcoholic, and I tell you what, we divorced when she was 7 or 8, and he was not drinking when we were married, and then he drank a little bit when we got divorced. Well, he drinks now, and I was always concerned about the predisposition that she had to alcohol, and it was always a concern for me, and it was something that we had not a constant discussion about, but that we talked about, and why it was important not to start to expose yourself to alcohol when you're young. My ex-husband started drinking when he was 12. So who is susceptible? Well, there again is that genetic component to it, and there is a certain allele on a gene that is lending a person to be more susceptible. It does not mean that you are doomed, but you're more susceptible. And if you have that gene, that's only one component of it. If we go back to that biopsychosocial model, it's family, it's environment, it's your personality. And so the kind of personality that we have does lend itself to having greater susceptibility. And if someone is highly anxious, if they have difficulty staying on track with something, or they're real impulsive, they're more likely. Individuals that have a lot of negative self-talk or self-esteem, they have a greater susceptibility. People that are really looking for external approval of being in, that's part of the susceptibility. Dependency is looking on others to be for your meeting your needs. I guess we could look at that as somebody who's personally insecure. They would be more likely, they're dependent. Um, People that lie a lot, that can't really look at themselves and see what their strengths and weaknesses are, they tend to be at greater risk. And others that think, well, I'm just gonna, it's okay, it's really okay, I'm just gonna smoke when I drink, kind of thing. Pseudo pleasure means that it's really not giving them pleasure. A person that doesn't really find joy in their day to day. They're looking for big events, or they're risk takers. Individuals that are in a controlled system where they don't feel like they have um, control of their own life. People who are depressed, and people who are looking for perfectionism. Those are the qualities that make somebody or lend somebody to be more susceptible to an addictive um, activity, addictive behavior. Commonly abused substances, there's psychoactive drugs, and it is a brain disease, and we tend to think that people are going to look at this as being a sense of willpower, and I want to encourage you very strongly to say it's not willpower. There is biochemical components to this, and those drugs can have an impact on changing brain chemistry for sure. So the first one to look at is caffeine, and caffeine is really highly used. We use we use it probably every day, and it's found in all kinds of beverages, tea, energy drinks, and also in some chocolate. And you'll find that drinks that are giving you focus, or energy, those often rely on caffeine or a caffeine-like substance. Now, caffeine does have a benefit, and it may provide a protective measure against Parkinson's, type 2 diabetes, liver disease, heart attack, stroke, but we do have to be aware that too much is going to be potentially harmful. And there are withdrawal symptoms that go along when you don't have caffeine. They're often more just a nuisance, although I will have to say a headache and the fatigue can make it really difficult to go to class. And if you have too much caffeine, more than some resources will say 400 milligrams. Well, some resources will say 400 is pretty much common for a lot of individuals every day, but more than 600 can become an extreme health risk, and that would be hypertension, diarrhea, seizures, chest pain, vomiting, and irregular heart rhythm. Many some life-threatening complications. Wanted to show you this real quickly, and this is a comparison, and you can see one thing that's good to get is an idea about where am I getting how much caffeine am I getting every day, and you'll see that these are primarily beverages with a drip coffee, and you'll see these values slightly different all depending on what resource that you have. So I've seen this as high as 300 and as low as this is a 12 ounce. I've seen this as high as 300. So I'm just looking at what has the greatest amount. Well, if you drip your coffee longer, it's going to be slow drip is going to have a greater caffeine content. And when we look at the Starbucks, that's Starbucks latte, it's going to have less because it has espresso and milk. So it doesn't have just the straight coffee. Black tea does have caffeine, and interestingly enough, Diet Coke has more than regular Coke. Alcohol is important to mention also. It is a depressant, and the important component along with this is that about 2/3 of domestic abuse cases are alcohol related, and we do know that excessive alcohol will put you at risk for injury, poor decision making, and unwanted sexual interactions, right? So we do want to be aware of alcohol, how we use it, how we take it, where we are, who we're with, etc. You've seen this before, I'm sure, of what the alcohol, one standard drink is 10 grams of alcohol. So if you look at what you're going to get, spirits are going to be your most concentrated source. And for beer, this is looking at your domestic beer. If you start to get to craft beers, it is wide variety, wide variety. And also with spirits, this is a 40% volume. When you get into proof, a higher proof, you're getting to a higher alcohol content there. And considering that we have many people that are in college are of legal age of consuming alcohol, and it's interesting to look at. Now, this is just some data from the readings. 1 in 4 students say that drinking had negative consequences on their academic performance, and most of the individuals that drink, there's a small majority of the individuals that drink, the majority of individuals drink safely. And there's a smaller number of individuals, and what we have is individuals that think that, well, everybody drinks that much, and truly it's not the case. But this just gives you an idea about assaults, sexual assaults, accidental injuries, and deaths related to alcohol use. The Health Promotion and Education Department in Syracuse, which is on the second floor, they're doing majority of their things. That should start up being face-to-face pretty soon here. But they have a nice link for alcohol and drug risk reduction, and it's primarily cannabis and alcohol, and gives you a little bit of a data on how much you're drinking and how to manage your drinking. And then in the upper left hand corner there's a YouTube, and this is linked right on the health promotion page. There's a 45-minute alcohol presentation by a certified health educator if you'd like to watch that. Tobacco is another one of the more common substances, and we are doing much better than what we did in the 70s when none of you were alive, probably, or majority of you were not alive. 40% of individuals over 18 were smokers in the 70s, and now in the 2010s it's down to 21%. So we're looking at a decline in the total number of smokers, but we're starting to see more women smoke, and we're seeing an increase in smoking in third world countries. And I want to give you a little bit more data from the CDC that I think is interesting. This gives you, by education, individuals that are over the age of 25, and if you look at the percentage column, the highest number of 35% of a group based upon their education level, those are individuals that only have a GED. So those are individuals that return back to school at some point and get their high school diploma via a GED. They have the highest rate of smoking. And if they go 0 to 12 years post or they don't have a diploma at all, they're 21%, 22%. So we've got lowest rate by individuals that have either an undergraduate or a graduate degree. And here we have Africa and Middle East, about 57%, and I looked up the cdc.gov and these numbers have not changed. This is also looking at annual household in terms of smoking, and you can see that the lower income group had the highest rate of smoking. And guess who's less likely to have health insurance? Probably the lowest income group. And as you see on the right hand side, individuals that are either uninsured or have Medicaid, those are the highest smokers, incidence of smoking. Who's more likely to smoke in terms of depression or anxiety? And it's the individuals who have severe anxiety. This link at the bottom will give you a link to some ideas of some people that have been able to quit in some different groups. So what I mentioned to you in terms of lesbian, gay, bisexual adults that smoke, that's about 19%, and it's about 14% if you just look at by sexual preference. Heterosexuals are about 14%. So that's just another way of looking at incidence. Other behaviors that can become destructive and difficult to quit are listed, and here's where you are looking at gambling, which is now more legal. We can play online. Very much more common for pornography to be have access to pornography, technology, tweeting. I don't know, think about how much time you're looking at Facebook or whatever. So The dysfunctional inner speech is what we say about ourselves, and it's the silent thoughts that we think. So I guess, I don't, how this is measured, I'm not sure, but just thinking, beating yourself up, and a lot of negative commenting that could be put on here as well. Consider what these addictions can have, how they can impact the different parts of wellness. And truly, it can impact relationships. It can have an impact in your ability to do well academically. It can have impact on your finances, your willingness to participate with a wider variety of people. It can, if we look at people uh, losing their job, there are people that have gotten in gambling and embezzled and have lost their job. That's the worst case scenario, but you can miss work because of alcohol. You can become sick. Um, Certainly, the addictions do not just impact one part of you, but potentially all parts of you. We can choose to change. To overcome an addiction, we choose to be changed. And I think that's really nice. And it's not, willpower is not the issue. I'm not a big fan, because then it makes it look like a person's weak. Many times it's not having the right knowledge, skills, or ability or support for a person to be able to make a change. But willpower is not what it's about. The treatments, variety of treatments, you can read more about these in your chapter. You're probably all very well aware of a variety of 12-step programs where you recognize that you have the addiction or the compulsion, and that you look for greater strength, and that you look at making amends and starting a different life, and it becomes part of a daily part of your life. Motivational enhancement therapy is moving in a different direction. Solution focused therapy, I think they're quite similar, but these two have a lot of non-judgmental components, in that we're not shaming people, because as we know, it's not a character defect. There's a physiological, psychological, and so many personality components that go along with an addiction. And it can be tiresome working with somebody with an addiction, or having a relationship with someone who is addicted, and not tie it to that person's character. But it is a disease. It's a brain disease. There are a number of medications that can help with alcohol, opioid addictions. There are medications that are, and I'm sure there will be continued to be developed. It's not a finger snap. It's not a finger snap. And it is not something that recovery doesn't necessarily mean you return back to your regular life. It will probably mean some changes of who you interact with, perhaps better relationships, better occupational involvement, better finances, and potentially a start of a better life. And as we stop and think about our regular life, is there something in your life that you count as an addiction to you? And these are just questions to think about. If there is something, once you consider how it's impacting you, your life, your relationships, remember all of your components of dimensions of wellness, it does. And how does it, what can you do to help others as they work on it? And I know that one of the things that is obvious, like for instance with food addictions, don't bring, I went to a party the other night, and a particular person was like guilting people if they wanted a piece of cake, which I thought, that is your problem. It's not everybody else's problem. You know, allowing ourselves to release that guilt associated with behaviors, and allowing someone to just say, I'd like a smaller piece, instead of guilting everybody, people who don't have problems with food. So I just think it's important to always be mindful of our own issues and how we uh, deflect or put them on other individuals as well. But don't smoke around people who are trying to quit smoking. Don't go to places that you know are going to be a trigger. Substitute a different behavior. Instead of, you'll see people that are quitting smoking, they'll get a little sucker. And so there are the things that we might need to do to help, and then also to be a good supporter and an example. So for moving forward, we can all kind of check in with ourselves and identify what kind of uh, behaviors are maybe not serving us well. Are they things that we're compulsive about that maybe aren't? Is it a behavior, or is it something that is not, that's kind of overwhelming other parts of your life? Work can become an addiction, and it can influence your family, your relationships, where you are so involved you don't engage in others. So consider those parts of your life that you might want to rethink, and not think about it just takes strength and willpower. That think about how we can replace, um, find what's triggering, and do our best to work together to help each other to be healthier in our life.